Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm glad you are here with us. Today, we are opening a file that is arguably the heavyweight champion of the New Testament. We are looking at the Epistle to the Romans.
It is good to be here, and you are so right about the weight of this letter. I mean, if you ask any student of the Reformation, or really any historian of the Western Church, they will point to this document as the match that, that lit the powder keg. It's the most systematic presentation of the gospel we have from the Apostle Paul.
Absolutely. And usually when we talk about Romans, we have this tendency to just jump straight into the theology. We want to get into predestination or justification or the law right away.
Sure.
And we were going to do that today. But we're taking a specific angle. We're looking at the source material from James Hastings' Dictionary of the Bible. We want to understand the historical context, the man, the moment, and the argument as Hastings lays it all out.
And that's the mission. We need to understand the why behind the letter. Why did Paul write it? Where was he standing when he dictated it? And specifically, what is the theological argument regarding justification and sanctification that, that defines our Reformed faith?
Right.
Hastings gives us a fantastic framework for this. He even points out things like undesigned coincidences that help confirm the history, which I think you will find fascinating.
I love a good historical mystery. So let's unpack this, set the scene for us. When we open the epistle to the Romans, where is Paul? What is happening in his life?
Okay, so to answer that, we have to look at the timeline. This letter belongs to what scholars call the central group of Paul's writings. That includes Galatians and the 2 letters to the Corinthians.
And Hastings suggests there's a specific order to them.
He does. He suggests that Marcion's order Galatians first, then Corinthians, then Romans is likely the chronological order.
So he has already dealt with the Galatian heresy, and he has dealt with all the mess in Corinth.
Correct. He's been through the ringer, so to speak. Hastings places the writing of Romans at the close of the so-called third missionary activity.
Okay.
So if you are following along in the book of Acts, this is the period described in Acts 18 through 21. Paul had just been through the riots in Ephesus, which was, a completely chaotic time, and then he spent 3 months in Greece.
And that 3-month period lines up with Acts 20, verse 3.
It does. It fits perfectly.
And Hastings is pretty confident that Greece here specifically means Corinth.
Oh, he is. And the evidence for that is internal to the letter itself. It is really quite clever how we can piece all this together.
Okay, so what are the clues?
For one, Paul mentions in Romans 16 that he is staying with a man named Gaius.
Which is a common Roman name, I'd imagine.
It is, yeah. Who is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 14, who is a member of the Corinthian church.
Ah, so there's a direct link back to Corinth.
There is. And then you have the bearer of the letter, Phoebe. She is described as a servant of the church at Cenchreae.
And Cenchreae is the port city of Corinth.
Precisely. It's the harbor. So you have the host, you have the courier, and you have the timeline. Acts 20 says Paul spent 3 months in Greece before heading back toward Jerusalem. Hastings argues, and I think the evidence is solid, that Romans was written during that 3-month window.
That makes a lot of sense. It puts Paul in a major city, probably during the winter months when travel was harder.
Right.
Which would give him the time to sit down and dictate such a massive work. But tell us about his plans, because he is writing to Rome, but he is not in Rome.
No, he's not. And his immediate travel plans were actually in the opposite direction. Acts 19 tells us Paul intended to go to Jerusalem first.
Right, for the collection.
The collection for the poor saints there, yes. After that, he planned to turn his steps toward Rome.
And this is where that term you mentioned earlier comes in, the undesigned coincidences.
Yes. This is a concept from the scholar Paley. It is when 2 different historical accounts, in this case, the book of Acts and the Epistle to the Romans, match up in these small, subtle ways that a forger would, never think to invent.
Give us an example of one.
Well, you can compare Romans 15 with Acts 19 and 20. In Romans, Paul writes about his hesitation and the danger he faces from unbelievers in Judea. He's anxious about it. Then you turn to Acts, and what do we see? We see the actual plots by the Jews that forced him to change his travel route. The internal anxiety in the letter perfectly matches the external history in Acts.
That's fascinating. It really confirms the authenticity of the timeline.
It does. It grounds the text in real history. This isn't just a theological treatise dropped from heaven. It is a letter from a real man who is very aware of the dangers ahead.
But that does raise a question. I mean, if he is going to Jerusalem and he just wants to let the Romans know, hey, I will see you soon, why write 16 chapters of dense theology? Why not just send a postcard?
That is the big question, isn't it? Hastings calls the prospective visit the immediate occasion. He's preparing the way for his visit. But you are right, a short note would have been enough for that.
So the length implies something else is going on.
A much stronger motivation, yes. And that motivation is the significance of Rome itself. Remember, Paul was a Roman citizen. Hastings points out that Paul was perhaps the first to grasp the magnitude of the empire for the expansion of the church. He had this kind of missionary statesmanship.
He targeted the big cities.
He targeted trade centers like Ephesus and Corinth. But Rome was the center of the world.
So he wanted the capital of the empire to understand the full worth of the gospel.
Correct. If the gospel could conquer Rome, it could reach the ends of the earth. And there is another factor here. The church in Rome was not an apostolic foundation.
Meaning neither Peter nor Paul started it.
Right. It likely started through travelers, perhaps Jews, who were present at Pentecost and then went back home. So Paul is not writing to his own children in the faith like he was with the Corinthians. He is writing to a church he's never even visited.
And that explains the different tone.
It does. Hastings makes a distinction about what the letter is not, and he says it is not primarily controversial.
Unlike Galatians.
Oh, very much unlike Galatians. Galatians is a fight. Paul is fighting for the very life of the gospel against the legalists. He is angry. In Romans, the tone is calm. It is conciliatory. Hastings notes that while he does warn them against false teachers in chapter 16, it feels more like a warning against a possible danger, not a fire that is currently burning down the house.
So he's not shouting at them. He's reasoning with them.
No shouting. He is setting out his gospel. But Hastings also says it is not a full dogmatic treatise. We often treat Romans like a systematic theology textbook, but Hastings points out it is incomplete in that regard.
Incomplete. That sounds almost heretical to say about Romans.
Well, I mean, consider what is missing. Hastings notes that it omits key doctrines Paul held dear, like a specific eschatology, the details of the end times, or the high Christology we see later in Colossians or Ephesians.
I see your point.
It is a true letter addressed to a specific situation, not a comprehensive encyclopedia of everything Paul knew.
It is a reflection on the universality of the gospel, which matches the universality of the empire.
That is the key theme. The empire is one. The gospel is one. The empire includes all nations. The gospel is for all nations.
So let's move into the text itself, the first 3 chapters. This is where Paul really lays out the universal need for that gospel.
And he starts with that famous thesis in chapter 1, verses 16 and 17. The gospel is the force of God unto salvation for all men.
For the Jew first, and also for the Greek.
Yes. But to prove that it is for everyone, he first has to prove that everyone needs it. And this is where we get the dark side of the opening chapters. It is a courtroom scene, and the prosecutor is just relentless.
He starts with the Gentile world. And Hastings describes this as an indictment of willful ignorance.
It is not that they did not know God. It is that they suppressed that knowledge. They denied the Creator. And Hastings notes the sequence here. Willful ignorance leads to moral decay.
When you disconnect from the source of holiness.
Your own holiness withers.
Yes, and the description in chapter 1 is brutal. I mean, it lists all manner of vices. Hastings notes that their conscience is defiled. They don't just commit sins, they applaud those who do them.
And that is the final stage of corruption celebrating vice. But then, in chapter 2, Paul just spins around and points the finger at the Jewish world. Yeah. And this is masterful. He anticipates the Jewish listener nodding along, saying, yes, those pagans are terrible.
And then Paul says, you do the same things.
Right. The possession of the law does not excuse sin. That is the whole argument. Hastings highlights the principle that God judges without distinction of persons. He judges based on deeds.
He says something really shocking to a first-century Jewish mindset.
He does. He says a Gentile obeying the moral law is better than a Jew disobeying the written law.
That is the tu quoque argument Hastings mentions. You also.
Yes. Yeah. Paul just turns the table on them. The verdict in chapter 3 is total. The whole world stands guilty. Hastings sums it up well. The law acts to intensify the conviction of sin, not to remove it. Its purpose is to close every mouth.
So the courtroom falls silent. Everyone is guilty. And that brings us to the solution. Justification by faith. This is the heart of the Reformation.
It is the new way. Hastings describes it as righteousness apart from the law through faith in Jesus. And we need to be clear about the method. Hastings uses the term propitiatory sacrifice.
Let's unpack that word, propitiation. It's a big theological word.
It is, but it basically means a sacrifice that turns away wrath. It satisfies the demands of justice. And the incredible thing is, God provides the sacrifice that he himself demands.
And the response from humanity is faith.
Yes, and Hastings defines faith here so nicely, not as a work we do, but as humble trust in a loving God. It excludes any claim of merit on our part.
And Paul doesn't just leave this as a theory. He brings in a witness. He calls Abraham to the stand.
The case of Abraham in chapter 4 is the historical proof. I mean, if anyone had grounds to boast, it was Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation. But Paul points out a chronological fact that Hastings highlights as crucial.
Which is?
Abraham was justified before he was circumcised.
That is a crucial timeline detail.
It is everything. Because if he was declared righteous before the ritual of circumcision, then righteousness cannot possibly depend on the ritual.
It depends on the promise.
It depends on the promise. Exactly.
Hastings mentions the beatitude here.
Yes, Paul quotes Psalm 32. Blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not count against him. It is the blessing of the man whose sins are hidden. The implication is massive. The promise comes apart from the law. We are the spiritual seed of Abraham if we share his faith.
Which Hastings describes as believing God even against nature.
Yeah.
Abraham believed he would have a son when his body was as good as dead. We believe God raises the dead.
Precisely. It is trusting the God who calls things that are not as though they were.
So we are justified. The judge has banged the gavel and said, not guilty. But we still have to live our lives. This moves us into sanctification. Chapters 5 through 8. Hastings calls this the life built on the foundation.
And here we shift from a courtroom to a comparison of two representatives, the two Adams.
The first Adam and the second Adam.
Right. And Hastings outlines what he calls the much more argument. The first Adam brought death. He failed. The second Adam, Christ, is the creator of a new humanity.
And Christ's strength is greater.
Paul argues that Christ's strength to save is much more than Adam's strength to destroy.
That is a comforting thought. Grace is stronger than gravity. But this leads to the inevitable question, doesn't it? If grace abounds where sin abounds, why not just sin a lot so we can get more grace?
The question of license. Every critic of the gospel of grace asks this very question. Hastings explains Paul's logic in chapter 6. It is not about rules, it is about status and union.
He talks about baptism.
Right. Baptism symbolizes dying to sin and rising to new life. Hastings puts it this way. It is a vital union with Christ. If you died to sin, how can you live in it? It is a logical impossibility for the new creature.
He uses the analogy of marriage, too.
Yes, we are free from the law like a wife is free after her husband dies. The old bond is broken, the old master is gone.
But then we hit chapter 7, and this is where things get really personal. The struggle.
This is one of the most debated chapters in all of Scripture. Hastings describes it as an intense personal section regarding flesh versus spirit. The law is holy, but sin uses the law to deceive us.
Does Hastings take a side on whether this is Paul the Pharisee or Paul the Apostle struggling?
He notes that Paul describes a torturing consciousness of needing to do good but failing. I mean, whether it is his pre-Christian experience or his ongoing battle as a believer, the realization is the same. The weakness of the flesh is sold under sin. It paints a really bleak picture of human willpower.
Which makes the transition to chapter 8 so powerful. There is, therefore, now no condemnation.
The life in the Spirit. Hastings calls it a triumph. We have the spirit of adoption. We don't cry out as slaves. We cry out, Abba, Father.
And Hastings mentions the golden chain.
Yes, the chain of salvation in Romans 8, verses 29 and 30. Foreknowledge, predestination, calling, justification, glorification. This is where the Reformed emphasis on election finds its bedrock. It is God's work from start to finish.
And it ends with that hymn of victory.
If God be for us, who can be against us? Hastings notes that nothing, absolutely nothing, can separate the believer from the love of God. It is absolute security.
So we have this high peak of assurance, but then almost abruptly the mood shifts in chapter 9. Paul is grieving.
This is the problem of Israel. If the gospel is the force of God, why are God's chosen people, the Jews, rejecting it? This is the next section of our discussion, and it's a difficult one.
Hastings points out that this section deals with divine sovereignty.
It does. Paul tackles the hard doctrine here head on. He looks at history. God chose Isaac, not Ishmael. He chose Jacob, not Esau. Hastings notes the illustration of the potter and the clay. God has the right to make one vessel for honor and another for dishonor.
That is a hard pill to swallow for modern listeners.
It is. Hastings calls God's mercy inscrutable, which means we cannot fully scan it or track it. He has the right to choose individuals. It's his prerogative.
But Hastings also balances this. He talks about human responsibility.
Yes, and this is so key. The text asserts Jewish responsibility. They were not rejected without cause. They sought their own righteousness. They heard the message, and they disobeyed.
So you had this tension, divine sovereignty and human responsibility held together in the text.
Well, they exist side by side.
And what is the future hope?
Yeah.
Is God done with Israel?
Hastings explains the remnant concept. God always keeps a remnant. And then he uses that beautiful illustration of the wild olive branch. The Gentiles are the wild branch grafted into the ancient root.
So we shouldn't get arrogant.
Correct. The mystery Paul reveals is that the hardening of Israel is temporary. It created a space for the Gentiles to come in. But the hope is that God has not deserted his people. His mercy will restore them. Hastings says this reveals that God's mercy is the final word.
So we have covered all of that doctrine, chapters 1 through 11. Now we hit the word therefore in chapter 12.
The shift to application, practical Christianity.
Hastings summarizes this as total surrender, living sacrifice.
Which is the only logical response to the mercies of God described in the first 11 chapters. And this plays out in duties, humility, diversity of gifts within the church.
And in chapter 13, response to governing powers.
Paying debts, obeying authority. Hastings reminds us this was written to Christians living in the capital of the empire under Nero, of all people. It was not some theoretical instruction. It was vital for their survival and their witness.
Then we have the issue of the strong and the weak in chapter 14. What is the specific problem Hastings identifies here?
It's disputes over food and days, probably Jewish dietary laws versus Gentile liberty. Some are eating meat, some are only eating vegetables, some are observing special days.
And what's the principle?
Individual responsibility. Hastings outlines it well. He stands or falls to his own master. We don't judge our brother in these matters of conscience.
But there is also the law of love.
Yes, and this is the check on our liberty. The strong must bear with the weak. We are not to please ourselves. The goal is to imitate Christ. If my liberty destroys my brother, then it is not liberty, it is selfishness.
Now, we're coming to the end of the letter. The final section deals with some textual issues that Hastings brings up. And this is a bit of a detective story again, the chapter 16 mystery.
This is a fascinating debate among scholars. Some argue that chapter 16 was actually a separate letter sent to Ephesus, not to Rome.
Why would they think that? What's the evidence?
Well, you look at the names. Paul sends greetings to Priscilla and Aquila, and in Acts 18 they are primarily associated with Ephesus. And then there's just the sheer number of people he greets, over 20 specific individuals. The argument is, how could Paul possibly know so many people in Rome, a city he had never visited? It seems more likely he is greeting his friends back in Ephesus, where he had spent so much time.
That does sound pretty convincing. But Hastings presents the other side of the coin.
He does. He mentions scholars like Sanday and Headlam, who actually found archaeological evidence of these specific names in Rome, inscriptions and such.
Well, kidding.
Yeah. And it turns out there was a lot of travel between the colonies and the capital. People were always moving back and forth. It is entirely plausible Paul knew many expats living in Rome.
So Hastings leans toward it being genuine to the Roman letter.
He thinks the question is open, but he believes the evidence for Rome is strong. It just shows Paul's incredible networking ability.
Hastings also takes a moment to refute the critics. He mentions the Dutch school and a man named Van Manen. What was their deal?
Yes, this was a group of critics who doubted Pauline authorship entirely. They just couldn't believe it. They thought the theology was too developed, too advanced for the first century. They argued that a man does not become the adherent of a religion and its reformer at the same moment.
So their argument was basically, this is too good. A normal person couldn't have written this.
That's the gist of it.
Yep.
And how does Hastings, or rather the source he quotes, respond to that? With a wonderful bit of understatement. He quotes a Professor Schmeitel who said, "Perhaps St. Paul was not an ordinary man."
I love that. The argument against it is basically, no one is that smart. And the answer is simply, well, Paul was.
Right. The assertion is that the letter is genuine. It fits the man.
So as we wrap up, let's summarize the character of this letter. Hastings says something striking here. He says Romans is not just theology, it is religious vitality.
That is the spirit of the letter. It binds the believer to the mercy of God. It is not just an intellectual exercise. Hastings writes that it reveals a heart where the love of God is shed abroad.
He connects it back to the personal experience of Paul.
Yes. Paul did not just sit in a library and deduce these things. He arrived at the mind of Christ through the gospel of grace. He found that in God's grace, there was strength to arrest the decay of the world. He found the secret of overcoming.
It is the passionate outpouring of one who has come into living touch with his heavenly Father.
That is the best way to describe it, yes.
So what does this all mean for us? We have walked through the history, the argument, the struggle, and the victory.
I think it means we need to read Romans differently. We need to see it not just as a source of proof text for our theological debates, but as a missionary document.
That is a great point. And here is a thought I want to leave our listeners with, something for you to chew on. Hastings mentions that Paul wanted to go to Spain. He says it in chapter 15. He wanted to take the gospel to the wild west of the empire.
Yes, he did. That was his next big project.
So consider this. The Epistle to the Romans, this magnum opus, this cathedral of theology that we've been discussing, was, in a very practical sense, a support-raising letter. He was explaining his message to the Roman Church in detail so they would understand his gospel and then support his mission to Spain.
That's a provocative thought.
And the thing is, we aren't even sure he ever made it to Spain. But in trying to get there, he gave us Romans. It suggests that the greatest theological work in history was a byproduct of a missionary heart. Theology exists to aid the mission.
That puts it all in perspective. The theology wasn't the end in itself. The glory of God among the nations was the end.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. It has been a real pleasure to look at this text through the lens of James Hastings.
It has been a joy.
For our listeners, we hope this renews your interest in reading Romans, not just as a study, but as an encounter with the strength of God. Until next time, keep thinking.